So, hey everyone, this project is relatively new for me. And what I've been trying to do is just carve out a new way for me to continue thinking about the usefulness of Wikipedia for helping build cultural understanding. So, when I did the prior work on Black Lives Matter, that started maybe like 7, 8 years ago now, but I wanted to return to Wikipedia when I had a new perspective to add to the scholarship. And something that I think is one of Wikipedia's most powerful yet underutilized features is its ability to just serve as a first stop or a first location in helping people learn about another culture or learn about another part of the world. And as my research question shows, I've been thinking a lot recently about how we can communicate knowledge about a single event to diverse audiences who may not have exposure to that particular cultural context. So um, when all the news was coming out recently about trials and the different sentencing for the people who were involved in the January 6th event here in the United States and Washington, D.C., I decided to head back to Wikipedia just to catch up and refresh. And something I noticed is that it's a very comprehensive summary of the events of the day, but it may not necessarily capture a lot of what the United States has experienced culturally over the past decades, if not hundreds of years. Next slide, please. And so what I'm moving towards thinking about is how Wikipedia is serving as a space to I saw in the Slack saw serve as like a watering hole or a space where we can develop common grounding around social issues and also cultural histories. And so if you imagine there are at least three groups that know about any particular event or happening, group A maybe has a strong association or a strong level of exposure rather to the event. And this could be they're personally involved, they know people who were involved, or they have a very strong identity affiliation to the actors in the event, and that gives them a particular nuanced perspective compared to, say, a group B that has a no prior exposure at all. So an event happens, they see a breaking news headline, and then they're trying to just source information to form an opinion or source information to just better understand what's happening in the world. And then the last group, they have a weak exposure. So they may have heard something about some voting issue or some counting of ballots that were being contested, but they may not necessarily understand how some of the headlines they've seen can result in such drastic actions. And so with this kind of a conceptualization, I've been thinking of both the consumers of Wikipedia as well as the editors and the people who are actually curating information about an event and how their backgrounds contribute to their roles in the process. Next slide. And I'm planning on doing this in multiple manners using mixed method approach. And I'm curious about both content, the people themselves, and also the discourse that happens in the talk pages. So I view Wikipedia as one of the rare entities where we can, at scale, just study and learn how humans make choices about a shared record that can be agreed upon by a large number of people, and that has consumption by a larger population that may not necessarily be aware of all of the deliberations and negotiations that happen. And so what I'm curious about firstly is looking at ways that the editors, how the editor population's own history of work or their activities, so the types of topical interests they have, how deeply embedded they are in, say, like the category where they're editing in events. I'm curious to see whether or not that plays a role in their activity, as well as the amount of content that they provide. Something that we observed that didn't make the original paper back in the day on Black Lives Matter is that the talk pages actually ended up being a really helpful space for a lot of editors who were really interested in Black Lives Matter, but had never edited in Wikipedia before. And we were seeing mentorship happen. We were seeing very helpful references to rules and to all kinds of standards and norms, I would say, around like sourcing and how to categorize information. And it was really a socializing space that happens where we were able to see, we didn't study it formally, we just kind of stumbled upon it. But we were able to see that there was something happening with Wikipedia editors who were entering into the space. Either they were intimately familiar with the context and then they had to learn more about how Wikipedia functions. But then also for the more experienced Wikipedia editors, they were constantly double fact checking and they were constantly engaged with the more expert editors. And so thinking a little more generalizably outside of just a single case, I want to just better understand how diversity is playing into the Wikipedia editors' understanding of the cultures and the cultural context that could be strongly associated with social issues and events, and then also try to better understand the consumption patterns. So with respect to like page views, for example, seeing if there are patterns where there are strong associations to more historical events as well as information. And so overall, this is still formative stages for me. I'm just now in the process of really carving out time where I can start to expand my focus here or put my bandwidth here. And currently I'm looking at US-based events, but I'm curious about how different language editions are talking about them, as well as doing some qualitative work with the talk pages and also collaborating with some scholars who use more of those methods to do interviews with editors. So I think I'm good on time, but this is where I'm going with this Wikipedia work. So thanks for listening.
You're very good on time. You've actually only spoken for 8 minutes, Marlon. So maybe I'll ask you a question if that's okay for your last 2 minutes.
Yeah, please do.
So
please do.
We've obviously heard a number of papers about places where Wikipedia editing kind of goes wrong, gets hijacked by a minority of people pushing a particular viewpoint. It sounds like reviewing some of these talk pages, you've had maybe a different experience. I mean, I'd be especially surprised if the January 6 page wasn't prone to a few of these problems, but maybe could you just comment on maybe what you've seen on some of these talk pages that you've started to look at them?
Oh yeah, for sure. There are definitely some more of the negative kinds of behaviors that have been broadly reported, not just in Wikipedia, but in a lot of social media. But there's also space there where education is happening, right? And there are productive spaces of discourse where, not speaking for the Jan 6, because I don't quite recall, but for the Black Lives Matter in particular, there were productive conversations about how to classify whether or not protests were actually affiliated with the broader movement and how to disentangle or differentiate, rather, whether or not they were. And those, even though they were, I would say, the conversations maybe like overall like contentious with respect to, hey, why'd you delete my content or why'd you revert my edit? As you read through the entire history or record of what happened, there was some learning there, I would say, that happens. And so that's the perspective I'm trying to bring into it, where of course we're going to have the negative hijacking of narratives, and the work that was presented earlier is beautiful to explain some of those issues. But on the other side, there is some growth that happens for editors as well.
Great, thanks so much, Marlon. That's a really interesting framing of Wikipedia as a kind of pedagogical project for its contributors. I'm sure that resonates with a lot of people.
Thank you all.
So our next speaker is Kaylea Champion, and I'll ask you, Kaylea, to share your PDF so that we can all see it.
Great. All right, awkward window switching complete.
Oh, sorry, I should have introduced you properly. Kaylea Champion is at University of Washington. Take it away, Kaylea.
No problem. Hi, Wiki History folks. I'm really thrilled to be here with you today. I'm Kaylea Champion. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a PhD candidate in communication at University of Washington, based in the Pacific time zone, where I live and work from the unceded ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people. I'm part of a multi-institutional lab called the Community Data Science Collective. I study how people collaborate to build amazing public goods, including Wikipedia. And the work I want to share with you today is built from a series of case studies across multiple language communities. But given our time limitations, I'm going to focus on just one case, only the qualitative and kind of storytelling part, as well as the critical work in a kind of broader mixed methods project. That case I'm focusing on is the Cedar Revolution, and what the Wikipedia articles associated with this event might reveal about history building and platform power, and in ways that I think can kind of problematize and push at this notion of collective memory. I'll elide some of the usual explanations about the importance of Wikipedia, or eliminate explanations of how Wikipedia works, although I would love to geek out on details at a later time. So the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon refers to the 2005 series of protests following the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafik Hariri. Protests were peaceful. Demonstrators demanded the end of Syria's often violent political interference in Lebanon. And the protests ended with political reforms, democratic elections, and the withdrawal of Syrian troops. Cedar Revolution goes by several names. The Cedar Revolution name itself, although common in English, is not a translation of the Arabic name used by some of the activists who led the protests. They termed it the Intifada al-Istiqlal, or Independence Uprising. Others called it the Cedar Spring. The image kind of evoked by these terms, Cedar Revolution, Intifada, and Spring, these are very different framings of the same event. And each of these kind of evokes maybe a different narrative about what the event actually means, about what story it's part of, about whose story it's part of. The source of the name in this case is in the article on Wikipedia itself. Apparently, it was the US Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs who coined this term. The name was picked up by media and is now recorded in Wikipedia itself. The name of the article was a choice, and it could have been otherwise. The simple fact of establishing a shared naming convention for the article kind of begs the question of who has the power to name events and therefore connect them with broader narratives. And the description here in the Wikipedia article kind of gives us a hint in some of the ways that individuals and communities, as well as platforms, play a role in the power of naming and the ways that naming can define what the complex events are all about. Although the Wikipedia article in English says that Intifada Istiqlal naming is more common in the Arab world, but Cedar Revolution is used in Lebanon. In Arabic Wikipedia here, what we see is Thawrat al-Arz, which is Cedar Revolution, as well. So the same name chosen for Arabic as has been chosen in English. Article naming is taken very seriously in Wikipedia. Renaming debates are often very fierce, but in the end, there's only one name, and all other answers, all other names are sort of subordinate. They become redirected from rather than the sort of canonical name at the top of the article. There's a more subtle discrepancy in naming that emerges here if you compare the info boxes in English and Arabic. So if we zoom in on just that info box here, note this kind of Intifada naming at the top, and then part of the color revolutions link at the top of the English info box. Here's the same essential info box in Arabic. We even see the same photo used again, although cropped differently. But this does not link to the Color Revolutions article. This is just a translate. This is just the same term over again, the Cedar Revolution. So here we are back in English with this link to Cedar Revolution as being part of the Color Revolutions. So if we click on this link to Color Revolutions, we get a description of the series of nonviolent protest events in primarily post-Soviet regions. And the article primarily then describes Yugoslavia, Georgia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, but it notes that some of these events have been called color revolutions, but differ from the above cases in some basic characteristics, including such examples as Lebanon's Cedar Revolution. So the problematic nature of the category as assigned in the info box is also explored here in the article that it links to. And as a sort of historian, it's encouraging to me to see this ambiguity and uncertainty being explored. There are important historical distinctions between what we might typically call a color revolution and the Cedar Revolution, reaction to an assassination of a prime minister, a demand to remove military occupation and to restore an eroded democracy, versus the post-Soviet experience. And each of these states that are also characterized as perhaps the more classic color revolution, likewise have their own story, as we all, I think, very well understand now with respect to Ukraine. But if we were asked if the Cedar Revolution was indeed one of the color revolutions, a quick reading of the Wikipedia article on the event says simply yes. It's right here in the info box. There's no contest, there's no distinction, there's no templates warning us that there's sort of there's a debate going on here. But a historian and different global communities might make an argument in either direction. We also might ask, to what extent is color revolution indeed a coherent way to typify events at all, and whose interest does it serve to group these revolutions together? Wikipedia community has marked the page with templates indicating problems with the article, but there's none in the info box. I mentioned the Arabic language version of the Cedar Revolution article doesn't have a link to the article on color revolutions, but here's the color revolutions article in Arabic. Similar first paragraph, this text here is quite similar to an earlier version of the English. Same map that you probably recognize from the English, same kind of link here to the articles on revolution, the same sort of template getting invoked here, but in Arabic instead of in English, including this sort of depiction of liberty. A bare-chested woman holding the French flag represents the idea of revolution in both English and Arabic. My sense is that Arabic language communities might think of liberty a little bit differently than this particular image displays. All that said, I do want to point out that both English and Arabic editions have this same box that seems to agree that this article is part of a series on the history of Lebanon. That's what this one says in Arabic, the same as in English, with similar subtopics here as well. Info boxes are a powerful and a terse navigational aid. Adding one to an article brings immediate value to information seekers. Displays like this are attractive, quick reference, very valuable if you're on mobile, if you're learning a language, you could sense make across topics. And adding them and editing them is very easy to do if you're a Wikipedian. That means an act of historical interpretation, declaring what is and what isn't a color revolution, is right there in your fingers. It's democratized, put in the hand of peer producers, but also structurally reinforced. The simple kind of factual assertion in these boxes conceals disputes, and the popularity of Wikipedia spreads this structuring of information widely. Any change to a template will make its way to many other articles and be translated elsewhere. But evoking these platform affordances by updating and placing an info box is not neutral. We've declared an event to be part of a broader historical narrative. That's an act of historical interpretation. Naming and categorizing is fundamental to our understanding. Structuring information is both a support for interpretation as well as a way to generalize. And Dr. Fortas described this with respect to the Egyptian Revolution. We see the power of Google described by Sophia Noble in Algorithms of Oppression. We see the power of numerous categorization schemes in Bowker and Stars sorting things out. But in the space of an info box, it's sort of like, it's so clean. The protest movements have start dates and they have end dates. They have concrete causes, goals, methods, results. It's also very tidy. Parties to the conflict, lead figures, casualties, all counted up and counted. But inside these tidy facts, we find contested narratives and spaces for substantial ambiguity. Events of the Cedar Revolution can be read as a color revolution, as an Arab uprising, as post-colonial, as an intifada. That tension, that lack of consensus is valuable. And the structured representation of narratives can serve to constrain that space of interpretation. So some of this dispute is represented in some places, on some articles, in some language editions. But I think across Wikipedia, the work of Wikipedians to categorize events, to strip them down to basic facts. That work, that Wikipedian work, does not appear here. That historiography lives deep in Wikipedia, and surfacing is often left to us, to work like Dr. Ford's and Dr. Klein's, as they have shared with us today. So just to wrap up, I want to invite us to consider the power of platform affordances and community decisions as they shape information spaces. In particular, the ease at which just an act of interpretation can be done, the power of naming and categorization that's incumbent on that, and how we might design information spaces to surface alternate narratives and encourage critical thinking. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Kaylea. That was a yet another amazingly detailed talk. I wasn't expecting so much detail at this conference with such short talks, but that was really good. Thank you so much. Now it's time for the final speaker of this section. I should have asked everyone how to pronounce your name, so I'm sorry if I've just butchered everyone's names. Alfonso Hegde, who's at USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, who's going to be talking to us about whether Wikipedia enables the forging of collective memory via consensus. And I think, Alfonso, you're going to share screen, aren't you? So I'll just...
Yes, yeah, let me, hello, everyone. Just get that shared. Okay, so let me start here. Can you guys see the screen?
Yep, looks
okay.
Perfect.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you guys so much for this talk. It's been a lot of great speakers so far. I'm really happy to be a part of this. I'm very much new to this space, just incoming PhD student at USC. So it's been amazing to be in conversation with the scholarship. My piece is a bit more of a broader overview. So I'm hoping it can kind of serve as a connective tissue, or in some way kind of informs some of the more detailed kind of case studies that have been featured so far. So what I'm attempting to do with my piece is I'm attempting to study how consensus is made through the lens of editors and the guidelines that they follow as the primary side of inquiry. I'm very curious about sort of the social conditions that are embedded within editing guidelines and policies on Wikipedia. So primary research question. So what are the social processes by which collective knowledge making takes place on Wikipedia? So I'm hoping to, as a format for this talk, kind of go over the rough guidelines and policy processes. Some of it might be repeated information for folks very familiar with Wikipedia, but I want to intersperse them with sort of informal conversations I've had with editors from Wikipedia thus far. Primarily, the methods I use for this talk is just I primarily do digital field work on these kind of meta pages. So critical analysis into the sort of pages that pertain to rules and guidelines, sourcing, wiki projects, etc. And so far, I've conducted more informal conversations with editors for the purpose of idea generation. And I'm hoping that through this sort of feedback in this session, I can kind of come up with a rich sort of question base to ask for the formal interviews I hope to conduct before the publication. Also just mentioning a couple of important kind of foundational theories I want to highlight with my project. So the first and foremost is this idea of open democracy that's advanced by political scientist Landemore. So kind of what I want to look at is, for those of you who aren't familiar, Landemore's work is very skeptical of this idea of electoral democracy, viewing it as very plutocratic and aristocratic. And she promotes this idea of open democracy and these principles as being much more akin to what democracy should be. And I'm curious about how Wikipedia as a sort of field site lines up with these types of these principles. And the second thing I want to go over is is Ben Light's environment of expected use in his walkthrough method piece. Because I'm kind of curious about using this framework of social expectations that are embedded within these kinds of policy pages that exist on Wikipedia, and how that kind of affects the outcomes and the various cases that we've seen so far tonight. And lastly, two quick other mentions are critical platform studies and this idea of legacy thinking, which is an important STS framework that I think is necessary to highlight. And just to start my talk, I'll kind of go over like a bit of an overview of Wikipedians and who they are. Who are the editors of this site? Wikipedians is a term. It's largely pertains to users and editors of Wikipedia. it's important to note that the majority of these are actually unregistered accounts, majority of edits, which I think is an important kind of embedded ideology, which essentially allows anyone to get involved. It's reducing the barrier of entry as much as possible. 28% are over 40 years old, 52% speak English primarily, and then a whopping 87% are male, which is, getting back to legacy thinking, an important kind of sort of baseline to start from, where it's like, if you want to kind of allow more diverse voices to thrive, you're going to have to deal with some of these inbuilt seniorities and allegiances that come out of the foundation. And then the last thing is it tends to attract kind of introverted personalities who thrive in an online environment, which is important, and I'll get to that as well. So kind of just to start, this is, I'll go through this slide kind of quickly, but essentially these are sort of the policy guidelines and essays are the three essential types of governing systems within Wikipedia editors. Policies are essentially de facto rules. So there's no hard and fast, rules when it comes to Wikipedia, but policies are generally what the majority of Wikipedia editors follow. Guidelines are more like recommendations, suggestions. They're generally also followed as well, but essays are sort of individual users' pontifications, very much kind of recommendations of what is sort of an aspiration, but is not necessarily what is actually happening within editing spaces. And I also want to note that there's actually important kind of language-based divisions in some of this material, because it pertains differently to different language spaces. So in English Wikipedia, policies don't always apply to Danish Wikipedia or Dutch Wikipedia, et cetera. And also mentioning sort of 5 pillars, the kind of key frameworks that Wikipedia editors abide by. This idea of viewing Wikipedia as this encyclopedia site. So it's not a space to get on your soapbox. It's very much intended to be a space to provide references for people. This idea of a neutral point of view comes up a lot, and as folks have mentioned, the secondary sources tend to be what are mostly privileged in this space. Third, it's free content for all. Respect and civility are sort of key perspectives that are privileged, and also there's no firm rules, so everything is adaptable. Everything is able to change. Also want to mention sourcing. So the way Wikipedia sourcing generally works is that secondary sources are often more favorable than primary research projects or experiments. This is partly due to, especially with controversial content, the desire to have a variety of opinions on content that doesn't have one truth to it, a variety of opinions available. So rather than having a primary source, a neutral sort of like secondary source is preferred, where the point of view lays out all of the various points of view on a particular topic, rather than presenting one as the truth. I also want to kind of mention the editors that I've talked to they frequently brought up this idea of like deferring to expertise. So a lot of the folks that I spoke with were very much of the mentality that you kind of have to remove your personal biases and defer to those who are more knowledgeable in a particular content area, rather than kind of like commit to your particular worldview. This, deferment as sort of, it kind of harkens back to this idea of collectivist and agreeable mindset, right? Where it's like not about your individual sort of expertise. It's more about like what the greater number of people agree with. And I also now want to sort of connect back to the earlier open democracy principles that I mentioned by looking at how the sort of existing guidelines map onto Landamore's original theory. So the 3 that I think are most relevant to Wikipedia are this idea of deliberation, sort of democratic representation, and full sort of transparency. So in the case of deliberation, Wikipedia talk pages are very much a site of deliberation, and it's very much encouraged within Wikipedia editing communities to prioritize collaborative sort of conversation rather than opposition and argumentation. In terms of democratic representation, is primarily a voluntary participatory space. And then lastly, with transparency, it's very important to mention that all of the Wikipedia content, meta pages, et cetera, are all accessible to the public. So they're available, editing histories are available. So it's an important kind of experience of kind of mapping onto Landamore's theory. And it's also necessary to note the areas maybe where some of these ideas begin to break down. So I wanted to kind of finish my talk by highlighting that this is not always a rosy picture, and there's very much areas where there's a requirement of dispute, where agreement isn't always possible, and there has to be some sort of formal process to dispute resolution that I believe other folks have hearkened to through the arbitration committee. So controversial content is essentially largely where a lot of the disputes take place. So these are the pages that are the kind of most heavily edited, with a lot of deep disagreements among editors. So a lot of the editors I talked to actually had no interest in engaging with these pages, because they kind of tracks with this idea of like an introverted personality type, right? Where a lot of the folks I spoke with, they were like, we don't engage with these controversial pages. One of the people I spoke with was experienced in the medical field, and he basically cited the vape content as particularly controversial, where there's no sort of exact science on the impact of vapes on health, and so he prefers just to not engage on that topic at all. But even within controversial content, there's still this advocation for arbitration as a last resort. It's still not something that people want to have to bring up immediately. There's several other layers of processes which I'll go into that are preferred. To edit wars are essentially what happens. It's one of the main kind of issues that occur within controversial content, which is essentially when two editors have kind of a personal conflict with one another. They keep editing the same editor's content back and forth. There's this sort of inbuilt idea.
I guess you're nearly at the end.
Yes, yeah. This is just like one more slide after this. So edit wars are essentially, it's kind of inbuilt in the ideology, is about kind of taking the personal ego out of it and trusting in the collective to weigh in. So rather than two editors kind of beefing or back and forth, there's this desire to have a third voice, a third opinion, or some form of external expertise to come in to actually provide accuracy on that topic. A lot of the editors I spoke with had the same point of view, where they said that if you kind of edit the same person back and forth, it becomes kind of a personal vendetta, and you have to be able to rely on another person that you may not know to come in and actually help arbitrate the truth in that particular case. I think it's important to mention that what this kind of implies is that it's the truth is not brought on by expertise, but it's rather brought on by a larger number of people who agree with a particular point of view, which I think is kind of an important framework that I've seen in a lot of the talks so far. And I'll kind of quickly go through this slide. So this is essentially just the admin and dispute resolution. So I kind of want to mention really quickly that being an admin essentially is a sort of a privileged position where within Wikipedia, where people in sort of admin roles tend to have a little bit more power in arbitrating, and they tend to sit on arbitration committees when it comes to controversial content. The editors I talked to were all completely, shockingly disinterested in being admins, because they viewed it as super bureaucratic and very much like out of the area that they were interested in. They viewed it as really an undesirable position, but it is a position that it notably has a lot of power.
Alfonso, I'm sorry, but I think we're just about out of time now. Did you just want to make a few final comments?
Sure. I'll end by just saying that I think for me, the important framework that I want to highlight was kind of going back to Professor Klein's original keynote, is this idea of like, if well-meaning and well-intentioned editors have no interest in kind of like getting involved in controversial content or being admins, what does that leave us with? I feel like it seeds the ground a lot of the time to people that are like prone to argumentation to be the ones to really have a lot more power in this sort of space. And it's this idea of, a small group of very well organized people as having sort of more authority in this space than necessarily those who have most expertise. So I think that's kind of the last thing I'll end on. But thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Alfonso. That was a great overview of many aspects of Wikipedia that hadn't really been covered so far. The meta pages and the bureaucracy and so on. Thank you very much for that.